What makes 6 members of the same political party break ranks on camera, knowing their names will follow them into every future campaign ad? And why did it take a legislative maneuver this ruthless to make it happen? Before we go any further, here's my ask. If you want the real mechanics of Washington instead of the shouting match version, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you actually want to understand how bills get built and broken in this town, and share this with someone who thinks Congress is too boring to follow, because what happened here is anything but boring. Let's start with where this bill went to die, because you cannot understand what just happened in the House without understanding the wall it was thrown against first. On July 14th, the Senate held a vote on a procedural motion connected to the Save America Act, legislation that would require proof of citizenship to register for federal elections and photo identification to cast a ballot. The tally came back 50 to 46. In most contexts, 50 votes out of 100 with several members absent would count as a win. In the Senate, it is not enough, because ending a filibuster requires 60 votes, and Republicans hold 53 seats. That gap has been the story for months. Majority Leader John Thune has said plainly and repeatedly that the votes simply are not there, not to break the filibuster entirely, and not to force what is sometimes called a talking filibuster either. It is, in his words, just a reality. That reality mattered enormously to President Trump because he had tied his own political credibility to this specific bill in an unusually direct way. To understand why this particular bill has become such a flashpoint, it helps to understand what it actually does in plain terms. The Save America Act would require anyone registering to vote in federal elections to provide documentary proof of citizenship, and it would require photo identification at the polling place itself. Supporters describe this as a common-sense safeguard that most Americans already assume exists. Critics describe it as an unnecessary hurdle addressing a problem that verified data suggests is extremely rare in practice. That underlying disagreement about whether this policy solves a real and significant problem or creates one where none previously existed is the engine driving every procedural fight that has followed it through Congress this year. President Trump made this bill personal in a way most legislation never becomes for a sitting president. Back in the spring, he said publicly that he would hold back from signing other legislation until Congress delivered strict proof of citizenship voting requirements. Think about what that actually means. A president deliberately freezing pieces of his own agenda as leverage for one single bill. He told House Republicans directly that he believed this legislation would shape the outcome of the midterm elections. And when the Senate math refused to move, he escalated further, posting publicly that the Senate should not leave town for its August recess until the bill passed, or better yet, until the filibuster itself was eliminated entirely. When Thune held his position instead of following that demand, Trump told reporters plainly that Thune had the votes and should get it done, adding that the situation was bad for Thune and bad for the Republican Party. So picture where things stood in the middle of July. A president refusing to back down. A Senate Majority Leader insisting the numbers simply were not there. A bill stuck exactly 10 votes short of what it needed. And then, on top of all of that, a moment of genuine tragedy. On the night of July 11th, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina died suddenly at 71, hours after returning from a trip to Ukraine, one of many such trips he had made over the years. His office described it as a brief and sudden illness, and the medical examiner's preliminary finding pointed to a ruptured aorta. Graham chaired the Senate Budget Committee, sat on appropriations and judiciary as well, and was one of the president's closest allies in the chamber. He had just secured his party's nomination for a 5th term. Beyond the human loss, which visibly shook colleagues on both sides of the aisle, his death tightened an already narrow Republican majority at a genuinely difficult moment with war. Funding decisions tied to the conflict with Iran still unresolved, and the clock running down toward the August recess. Graham's death also carried a specific symbolic weight inside this exact fight, because he had been one of the loudest Republican voices pushing colleagues to find a legislative workaround for the Save America Act, including floating the idea of moving portions of it through reconciliation months before House leadership actually executed that strategy. President Trump publicly stated afterward that Graham had spoken with him about the bill's prospects just hours before. His death, and some of the most vocal conservative senators subsequently urged colleagues to treat passing the legislation as something close to an obligation owed to Graham's memory. That emotional framing added yet another layer of pressure onto an already strained Senate calendar, on top of a health-related absence from another senior Republican senator that had further narrowed the working majority available for any close vote. That is the exact situation Speaker Mike Johnson was watching unfold from the other side of the Capitol. A dead end in the Senate, a frustrated president, a shrinking calendar, and a party still trying to figure out how to move forward after losing one of its most effective legislative operators. So ask yourself the question Johnson actually had to answer. If the front door will not open no matter how hard you push, what do you do instead? You stop pushing on that door and you start looking for another way into the building entirely. On July 22nd, the House did exactly that, and it did it through two separate moves on the same day, each one worth understanding carefully because the strategy behind them tells you far more about how Washington actually works than any single vote total ever could. The first move involved the National Defense Authorization Act, the annual bill that funds and authorizes the entire American military. This is normally one of the most reliably bipartisan pieces of legislation in Washington, passed every single year for more than 6 decades without fail. This year's version authorized roughly $1.15 trillion, including pay raises between 5% and 7% for military personnel, expanded weapons production, and replenishment of stockpiles that had been drawn down by the ongoing conflict with Iran. Using a procedural maneuver, House Republicans attached the Save America Act directly onto this defense bill before sending it to the Senate. The full election provisions, proof of citizenship, and voter identification now riding inside the one piece of legislation that is genuinely difficult for anyone to simply ignore. The vote was 216 to 212. 4 votes. That was the entire margin, separating the strategy from collapsing before it even reached the Senate floor. Let that math sink in for a moment, because this is the actual strategic logic behind the whole maneuver. For more than a year, Senate Democrats had been able to block this bill quietly, through procedural means that most voters never see or think about. Filibustering a standalone election bill barely registers outside of Washington. It reads as process, not substance. But blocking a defense authorization bill during an act of war, months before a midterm election, is a completely different kind of vote. It means standing in front of the country and voting against pay raises for every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine currently serving. There is no press release that fully explains that away, and no 30-second campaign ad that survives it cleanly. Johnson did not change the underlying content of the bill. He changed the political cost of opposing it. There is a specific term for this kind of legislative maneuvering worth understanding, because it explains why this particular tactic proved so effective. Lawmakers sometimes call this a must-pass vehicle strategy, attaching a contested provision to legislation that carries consequences too significant for most members to comfortably vote against, regardless of their feelings about the attached provision itself. It is not a new tactic in Washington. Both parties have used versions of it for decades, but the specific pairing here, election policy riding alongside military pay and war funding during an active conflict, created an unusually sharp version of the dilemma. A member voting no was not simply objecting to citizenship requirements in the abstract. They were casting a vote that could be described, accurately or not, as opposing funding for troops currently deployed in an active conflict zone. That framing carries enormous weight in a district where voters are paying close attention. He was not finished there either. That same Wednesday, the House also passed a second measure, a budget resolution setting up a new reconciliation package, the third of this particular Congress, branded by leadership as the Save and Protect America Act. That vote was even tighter, 216 to 2. 114, a 2-vote margin. Reconciliation matters here for one specific reason. Bills that move through the Senate using reconciliation rules only need a simple majority, 51 votes, with no need for any Democratic cooperation at all. It is the same legislative tool Republicans used for a major budget package the previous year. This particular framework included $95 billion total, with $73 billion directed toward defense and intelligence spending connected to the Iran conflict, $12 billion in assistance for farmers, and $10 billion placed under the House Administration Committee, structured as grant funding meant to encourage individual states to voluntarily adopt election measures, similar to those in the Save America Act. Notice the shift in approach there, because it is subtle and worth sitting with. Senate rules require that reconciliation bills deal with budgetary matters, not broad policy mandates, and Senate Republicans themselves had already acknowledged that the full Save America Act would likely fail that specific procedural test, a review process informally known on Capitol Hill as the birdbath. So instead of writing the policy as a command, House Republicans wrote it as a financial incentive, money flowing towards states that choose to adopt these measures on their own. Reconciliation speaks the language of dollars, not directives, and this approach was built specifically to fit inside that language. It is worth understanding exactly how unusual this specific workaround actually is within the broader history of reconciliation legislation. Reconciliation was originally designed as a narrow budgetary tool meant to help Congress align spending and revenue with previously agreed targets, not as a general purpose mechanism for passing contested policy that could not otherwise clear the Senate. Over the past 2 decades, both parties have gradually stretched that original purpose further than it was initially intended to go, using reconciliation for major healthcare legislation, tax policy, and now, potentially, elements of election administration. Each time this happens, it draws criticism from whichever party currently sits in the minority, criticism that tends to fade considerably whenever that same party later finds itself in the majority and facing the exact same procedural temptation. Not everyone inside the Republican coalition was fully on board with this approach, and it is worth giving you the complete picture rather than a simplified version. One Florida congressman described the grant program skeptically, arguing that states opposed to the measures would simply decline the funding, summarizing his own preference bluntly as favoring direct mandates over financial incentives. A Texas congressman took the opposite position publicly, arguing that a mandatory national requirement was the only version of this policy actually worth pursuing. That disagreement inside the Republican coalition over incentives versus mandates has not been resolved, and it remains a live fault line worth watching. There were also outright defections on the floor itself. 2 Republicans voted against the budget resolution, largely over concerns about the lack of spending offsets for the new funding involved. An independent member who had left the Republican Party earlier in the year voted no as well. On the defense bill specifically, 7 Republicans voted against final passage. This was not, in other words, a perfectly unified coalition marching in lockstep. It held together by the narrowest possible margins on both measures on the same day. Which brings us to the specific development that gives this entire story its title, 6 Democrats voting yes. When the defense bill passed 216 to 212, the winning margin was not entirely Republican. 6 Democratic members joined the majority. Their names are worth knowing individually, because the pattern among them tells you something important. Henry Cuellar of Texas, Don Davis of North Carolina, Jared Golden of Maine, Vicente Gonzalez of Texas, Adam Gray of California, and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez of Washington. Look closely at that list and a clear pattern emerges immediately. These are not members representing safely Democratic coastal districts. These are members holding some of the most competitive, closely contested seats in the entire country, districts where every vote genuinely gets scrutinized by voters who pay close attention to exactly this kind of decision. Look specifically at what these 6 districts actually have in common beyond simple competitiveness. Several of them cover regions with significant working-class populations, areas with a strong military or veteran presence, or districts that have swung between parties in recent election cycles, depending on which candidate more convincingly addressed kitchen-table economic concerns. Representatives in seats like these often describe themselves as practical rather than ideological, prioritizing visible, tangible wins for their district over strict alignment with national party messaging. A defense bill containing direct pay raises for military families fits that practical profile precisely, offering something concrete these members can point to directly, regardless of how the broader election provisions attached to it eventually get resolved in the Senate. Before we go any further into what this crossover vote actually means strategically, one quick favor. If breakdowns like this, careful about the actual mechanics rather than just the outrage, are what you are looking for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this fight is moving into the Senate next, and there's a great deal more still to track. When the moment came to cast a public recorded vote against a bill that combined military pay raises with election provisions, all 6 members made a similar political calculation. For members in tightly contested districts, the risk of voting yes appeared smaller than the risk of voting no. That is a meaningful shift, because throughout this entire fight up to that point, Democratic leadership had maintained a completely unbroken line on this specific legislation. Not a single defection, at any earlier stage, on any earlier vote tied to the Save America Act itself. That unity had effectively been the entire strategy holding the opposition together. And unity, once broken even slightly, tends not to simply heal back to where it was. Every Democrat currently representing a competitive district just watched 6 colleagues cast this exact vote and survive it politically, at least so far. In situations like this, the first break in a unified front is typically the most politically expensive one to make. Whatever comes after it tends to be comparatively cheaper. It is worth giving proper nuance here rather than flattening this into a simple story of capitulation, because at least one of these 6 members has been explicit publicly about her specific reasoning. Marie Gluesenkamp Perez released a public statement explaining that she voted for the defense bill specifically because of the military pay increases and manufacturing investments it contained, while explicitly objecting to the election provisions that had been attached to it. In that same statement, she noted that Senate Republicans had already made clear there was no realistic path forward for the Save America Act to actually pass the Senate as written. In other words, her calculation appears to be that she receives credit for supporting service members, while betting that the Senate ultimately strips the election language out before any final version reaches the president's desk. Whether that bet pays off is genuinely the central open question hanging over everything that happens next. Consider the specific political risk she is actually managing with that calculation. If the Senate does eventually strip the election provisions and pass a cleaner defense bill, her vote becomes simple to defend. She supported troop pay, plain and straightforward. But if the election provisions somehow survive in the Senate, or if a version of them arrives later through the reconciliation track, she will need to explain a yes vote on a package that ultimately included the more contested policy she publicly said she opposed. That is the genuine risk every one of these 6 members is carrying forward from this specific vote, a bet on how the next several months of Senate maneuvering actually plays out, made without any guarantee of how that maneuvering will ultimately resolve. And answering that question requires understanding the specific procedural tool sitting at the center of this entire fight, and the reason Senate leadership has been so reluctant to use it. Technically, a simple majority of senators can vote to eliminate the filibuster entirely for legislation, an option commonly called the nuclear option. It has happened before, though only in narrower circumstances. In 2013, Senate Democrats eliminated it for most presidential nominations. In 2017, Senate Republicans extended that same elimination to Supreme Court nominees specifically. In both cases, both parties insisted at the time that the legislative filibuster itself, the version that protects actual laws rather than nominations, would remain untouched. The reason for that restraint is straightforward and applies regardless of which party currently holds the majority. Every majority in Washington eventually becomes a minority again. Eliminating the filibuster to pass one bill today hands whichever party wins the next majority a tool with no remaining safeguards attached to it. That calculation sits directly behind Thune's continued reluctance, and it explains why he keeps repeating publicly that the votes to actually change Senate rules simply do not exist within his own conference, regardless of pressure from the White House. It is worth understanding just how consequential that reluctance actually is within the broader institutional history of the Senate. The legislative filibuster has survived multiple moments of intense pressure over recent decades, moments when frustrated majorities in both parties seriously considered eliminating it entirely to push through a priority piece of legislation. Each time, enough senators from the majority party stepped back from that option, usually citing exactly the same long-term concern that today's convenient tool becomes tomorrow's weapon in the hands of an opposing majority. That pattern has held for years, but it has also been tested more severely with each new fight. In this particular moment, with a popular sitting president applying direct public pressure, represents one of the more serious tests that institutional restraint has faced in recent memory. We are now well past the halfway point of this breakdown. If you have made it this far, you clearly want to understand the actual mechanics rather than just the headline version of this story. So do me one favor. Share this with somebody who keeps asking why Congress feels so gridlocked, because this specific fight is one of the clearest examples of exactly why that gridlock exists and how creative lawmakers get when they try to work around it. Here's where every piece of this actually sits right now. The Defense Authorization Bill, with the Save America Act attached inside it, is heading into the Senate, where removing the election provisions means having a public fight over troop pay in the middle of an election year, a fight neither party particularly wants to have visibly. The reconciliation framework, carrying its $10 billion election-related grant program, moves forward on a separate track, with relevant committees instructed to write the detailed legislative text by mid-September, meaning nothing final on that specific track arrives before autumn at the earliest. House Republicans have also pushed related election provisions into additional legislative vehicles, including a bill connected to congressional stock trading restrictions, a genuinely popular cause across a wide swath of the political spectrum. Multiple bills, multiple pressure points, all converging on the same closely divided Senate chamber. In fairness, it is worth presenting the strongest argument on the other side of this debate clearly, because you should understand the full shape of this disagreement rather than only one half of it. Opponents of the citizenship documentation requirement argue that it could genuinely burden millions of eligible American citizens who do not have easy, immediate access to documents like birth certificates or passports, particularly older voters, low-income voters, and people who have changed their name through marriage or other circumstances. Voting rights researchers cited in mainstream reporting have placed that potentially affected number as high as 20 million people nationally. Supporters of the requirement respond that verifying citizenship before allowing someone to vote in federal elections represents about as basic a standard as any democratic system could reasonably ask for, and argue that states can and should build verification systems that confirm eligible citizens without wrongly turning away people who actually have the right to vote. That specific argument over how many legitimate voters might be caught up in a documentation requirement versus how basic that requirement genuinely is will continue playing out in every relevant committee and every Senate office between now and whatever final vote eventually happens. It is worth adding one more layer of nuance to this specific debate, because both sides also disagree sharply about how significant the underlying problem actually is in the first place. Supporters of the requirement point to public concern about election integrity as justification enough on its own, regardless of how frequently documented cases of non-citizen voting actually occur. Critics counter that available data from state election officials and independent researchers consistently shows confirmed instances of non-citizen voting to be exceedingly rare relative to the scale of the potential burden being proposed. Neither side has fully persuaded the other over the several years this broader debate has been running. And that persistent disagreement over the actual scale of the problem, layered on top of the disagreement over the proposed solution, is exactly why this fight keeps resurfacing in new forms rather than reaching any kind of lasting resolution. Now, step back from the individual argument over documentation burdens and look at the larger shape of what has actually changed over this specific stretch of weeks. 30 days earlier, the Save America Act was effectively a dead letter, a standalone bill stalled permanently at 50 votes with no realistic path forward. Today, it exists as a provision inside a House-passed defense package, with a separate reconciliation backup plan running alongside it, and 6 Democratic names now attached to a yes vote for the first time anywhere in this entire multi-year fight. Legislative walls like this one rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They tend to crack first in small, specific places, and then those individual cracks gradually connect to each other over time. So the underlying question now moves to the full Senate, and it is a genuinely difficult one for members on both sides to answer honestly. When this combined package eventually reaches the Senate floor, are individual senators prepared to stand in front of the voters they will face in November and explain a vote to block military pay raises specifically in order to stop a voter identification requirement? That is the exact political dilemma this legislative maneuver was designed to create, and there is no version of that vote that stays quietly hidden from public view once it actually happens. There is a deeper pattern worth understanding here, too, one that extends well beyond this single piece of legislation. Washington runs on exactly this kind of procedural maneuvering far more often than most people following politics casually ever realize. A bill that cannot pass on its own merits gets attached to one that can. A policy mandate that cannot survive a specific procedural test gets rewritten as a financial incentive instead. A closely divided chamber gets navigated not through persuasion in the traditional sense, but through careful sequencing, timing, and an understanding of exactly which votes carry political costs that individual members simply cannot afford to absorb heading into an election. Understanding these mechanics does not require taking a side in the underlying policy debate. It simply requires paying attention to how power actually gets exercised inside a system built, quite deliberately, to make that exercise difficult. It is also worth acknowledging, honestly, that this specific fight sits inside a much larger, more emotionally charged national conversation about voting access and election integrity, a conversation that has been running for years across multiple election cycles and shows no sign of resolving itself cleanly anytime soon. People on every side of that broader conversation tend to view legislative maneuvers like this one through a lens shaped by which outcome they already favor. Supporters of stricter voting requirements will likely view Johnson's strategy as clever, effective, and entirely fair given the rules of the institution he operates within. Opponents will likely view the same maneuver as a cynical exploitation of must-pass legislation to force through a policy that could not survive an honest, standalone vote. Both of those reactions are genuinely understandable, given each side's starting assumptions, and neither one is simply wrong to hold, even though they lead to completely different conclusions about whether what just happened represents skilled legislating or troubling erosion of normal process. What happens next depends heavily on decisions that have not yet been made publicly. Whether the Senate strips the election provisions out of the defense bill entirely and negotiates a separate, cleaner version with the House. Whether individual senators in competitive states decide the political risk of blocking military pay raises outweighs their objections to the underlying election policy. Whether the reconciliation track, moving more slowly through September and beyond, ultimately becomes the more durable vehicle for at least part of this policy to actually become law. And whether the 6 House Democrats who crossed over on this particular vote find themselves standing alone, or whether additional members in similarly competitive districts eventually follow a similar path as the political calculation around this issue continues shifting. None of those questions have clean, certain answers yet, and anyone claiming total certainty about how this specific fight ultimately resolves is getting ahead of what is actually known right now. What is certain is that a bill widely considered dead just a month ago is no longer dead, that a previously unbroken wall of opposition just showed its first visible crack, and that the coming weeks inside the Senate will determine whether that crack widens into something much larger, or whether it gets quietly patched over before it ever reaches that point. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of how this actually works, mechanically, rather than just another round of outrage, that is exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment telling me whether you think the Senate ultimately passes some version of this package. And if you are willing to share it, tell me which state you're watching most closely, because the coming Senate vote will be decided district by district, senator by senator, exactly the way this House vote just was. And share this with someone who needs to understand the actual mechanics behind a headline like this one, instead of just the headline itself. 6 names crossed a line that had not been crossed before. A speaker built a trap that turned a quiet procedural blockade into a public, unavoidable choice. And a Senate that has spent over a year saying no is now staring at a version of this fight it cannot simply ignore its way past. Whatever happens next, remember how this particular crack actually formed, not through persuasion, in the traditional sense, but through the careful, ruthless arithmetic of exactly which vote costs more than the alternative. That is how Washington actually moves, more often than most people watching from the outside ever fully realize. One narrow margin, one difficult vote, one crack at a time. Whatever you personally believe about proof of citizenship requirements or about the specific tactics House leadership used to force this particular vote, the underlying lesson here applies regardless of which side of that debate you land on. Legislative power in a closely divided Congress rarely comes from having the better argument in the abstract. It comes from correctly identifying which vote your opponents genuinely cannot afford to lose and structuring the choice in front of them so clearly that avoiding it becomes harder than simply making it. That is precisely what happened inside the House on July 22nd, and it is exactly the dynamic the Senate now has to work through. One senator, one competitive state, and one uncomfortable vote at a time in the weeks between now and whatever final version of this fight eventually reaches the president's desk.